Joining us now is Seth Kaplan with the Airline Weekly. Bring us up to date. When you hear about this, a computer glitch, but we're talking about United Airlines, and so far 3,500 flights affected. How can something like that happen?
Yeah, well, that's the question we're all going to have to try to find out here in the next several hours. It's not unprecedented, and I mean, the good news from a safety perspective is that you always have lots of redundancies in place. In all likelihood, we're talking about a huge inconvenience, but not probably a safety issue, although we'll have to hear more. Not at all unprecedented for United in particular, because just a little more than a month ago, they had something that, at least on the surface, sort of similar. A very brief outage in that case that grounded their flights for about 8 minutes one morning. United, by the way, for perspective, an airline that has had its share of operational issues over the past few years, an airline that went through what you might call somewhat of a messy merger with Continental, actually adopted Continental systems, the systems from the smaller airline, brought them to the larger airline, United, and yeah, had some issues trying to put it all together. Generally speaking, United has been more reliable over the past year or so, but as we see here this morning, obviously, still some work to remain.
All right, well, you said this happened last time, and it was a brief ground stop, 8 minutes. We're talking about now, we're approaching almost close to an hour since this has started. But once they lift this ground stop, it's not like, hey, all right, everybody, get your boarding passes, let's hop on into this plane and get on your way. The ripple effect, the domino effect that we may see from this may be well into the day tomorrow. And what can they expect as far as passengers who are, already walking this thin line of patience here, trying to get on their flight and not getting any updates?
That's exactly the case, the ripple effect, because, even if a flight is, let's say, a half hour or so late into a hub like Newark, Houston, Chicago, Denver, places like that, what you get then are passengers missing their connections onto the next flight. Then you have to accommodate them, and you can just imagine how that cascades through the system. The good news, if there is any, is that today is Wednesday, and if you had to pick a day of the week for this to happen, you would want it to happen on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, when typically you do have more empty seats to reaccommodate those passengers than you would have, let's say, on a Friday night or a Sunday night. So, this could be worse, but obviously no consolation to the passengers we're hearing from on those flights who are stranded.
I'm sure you have ripple effect across the board, even with other airlines, too. How are other major airlines going about it? And I'm sure they're feeling it as well.
Yeah, United is probably at this moment trying to reaccommodate some of those passengers onto those airlines. The problem is that when we're talking about an issue which sounds to be with its passenger service systems, that becomes harder. When you're talking about passengers who, if they don't have that printed boarding pass, are having issues, United probably at this moment can't do some of the things that it would normally be able to do. If you had, just on a regular day, a cancellation because of a mechanical issue, very easy nowadays to say, hey, if there's an American flight leaving to the same destination, let's get those passengers over there. But on a day like today, all of those things are probably more difficult than usual. So the usual remedies out the window, and yeah, this is going to take some time to recover. And again, if anything, it is the summer, as Tom Costello mentioned. That's the bad news. The good news is that it's right in the middle of the week. And so if they do, in fact, get everything back up and running sometime soon here, they'll probably be able to work those passengers through their system before too long.
How about international passengers? Somebody in London, somebody in Paris waiting to get on a United flight to come here home?
Well, at this moment, really, we can only, it's more of an educated guess than anything else. I mean, those stations, as an airline calls them, the airports out there, rely on most of the same systems. So, probably experiencing some of the same issues. That number, by the way, 3,500 flights that we're hearing affected. I just checked a minute ago. In today's schedules, United has about 5,000 flights scheduled. So, it sounds like the vast majority of its network is impacted. But again, we'll just need some more clarity about which particular systems are being impacted before we can even move on to guessing what the exact outcome might be of this. But a mess for one of the world's largest airlines today, no question.
Absolutely. They came out with their statement, and I'm going to read it now. They said, "We experienced a network connectivity issue this morning. We are working to resolve this and apologize to our customers for any inconvenience. Of course, they're going to keep us posted. What does that do? And it may be too early to have this discussion, but based on the people there who are saying, you know what, I was considering an American flight. I was considering a JetBlue flight. I'm never flying United again after this story, too. What does it do in that standpoint as far as working to repair something like this to gain back customers that they may be losing?
Yeah. Well, the history is that in time, airlines do recover when you're talking about something like this, as opposed to, God forbid, something much worse that can happen to airlines. Even then, over time, passengers regain trust. But yeah, an airline that really was kind of teetering in terms of its reputation of reliability. Delta, for example, on the other hand, an airline that had been a mess some years back and has invested a lot, really become a more reliable airline. And Delta claims that some of its very big profits that it's had in recent quarters have been because consumers prefer it, partly because of its reliability. United, obviously, right now at the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, as we are watching this closely, Seth Kaplan, thank you for that. I want to go now to Seth Kaplan when it comes to how this is affecting the ripple effect that we'll see when it comes to disruptions piling up in the United States and even globally, with worldwide travel affected as well. Seth, you're back with us here. Tell us a little bit about what they're doing now, especially with some news that, maybe some airports and planes may now be resuming that problem or resolving it.
Right, and we heard that little bit of good news about the regional carriers, and important to note that, in the U.S., I think as most people who travel know, regional carriers, that's no small thing. You go to a hub, and depending on what hub you're at, half the jets you look at might be those smaller regional jets operated by other carriers. And that, by the way, probably accounting for that discrepancy that we hear between that 3,500 number of flights and the 5,000 flights that United is running today, that 5,000 number, including the regional airlines. But certainly around the world, those are all United jets in places like London, Tokyo, and so forth, and presumably impacted in a similar way by this outage. So people in those destinations, part of it is just a question of where you are, how many flights are there to where you're trying to get to. So, you can imagine that, a flight from Newark to Chicago, let's say, fortunately at least, there are many flights throughout the day. And if in fact we're lucky that there were some empty seats on some of those flights, as I'm guessing, even though the middle of the summer, at least it is the middle of the week, wouldn't take too long to get those people to their destinations. But when you're talking about overseas destinations with only 1 or 2 flights a day and a plane load of a few hundred people who have been impacted, that's a whole different story. And for those people, it could take another day or two.
Obviously, the priority here for United Airlines is to fix this, just get these planes starting to take off again back in the sky. But how are they going to filter out and let people on the ground, especially their staff, the ticket agents, the pilots, in informing the rest of the passengers of what's going on?
Yeah, and those are the people, some of these stories we hear, the gate agents,
yeah, they're on the front lines having to deal with the passengers who are getting impatient and irate.
Yeah, and you really have to feel for them. And as we heard, it sounds at least like passengers are being somewhat patient with them, understanding in this case, there really is nothing that those people on the front lines can do. But yeah, different situations for those different work groups. With pilots, these are people who beyond a certain point aren't going to be able to fly if this goes on too many hours. Very strict regulations about, them timing out at some point and just not being able to operate another flight. And so, the airline is in contact with them almost certainly about those kinds of issues. And with the people on the front lines, as you said, the gate agents, it's more about, just getting them the information to get to the passengers. But, it's one of these things where when it rains, it pours. And in the end, you're just going to have a gap in information where passengers at the airports presumably are learning as much, watching TV, listening to us as they are, in some cases, from the people there at the gate.
Interesting you bring up, the very strict regulations when it comes to how long flight crews can be working. So I want to ask you something. Could this happen as far as a hypothetical? There's a crew that's been sitting there maybe 1-2 hours. Then they say, yep, you got the A-OK, your flight can take off, but that crew needs to switch out. And they're like, okay, sorry, can't fly. We got to switch out. You got to get on another plane. Is that something that could very well be a possibility for passengers?
Yeah, it usually wouldn't happen as soon as let's say just an hour or so, because of course they build in, some pad there, even in a much more routine circumstance. It's not unusual for a flight to be delayed by that. But yeah, at a certain point it happens. And that, by the way, interestingly, is one thing that actually goes more smoothly at a hub than it does at what airlines rather call the outstations, the places where, and that's because they just don't have as many other reserve pilots in those places at the busy hubs, lots of other people that at least they could just bring in.
We got to take a break, but as we leave you, take a look at this shot here from Chicago Airport, and just astounding. That's not a live look right now. That is on tape earlier where some flights were taking off, but you saw there at the gates many of those United flights just sitting there with the passengers waiting as they resolve this major computer glitch affecting United Airlines flights nationwide and globally. Seth, thanks so much. We're going to keep you updated on this breaking story throughout the rundown here this morning on MSNBC. We'll be right back. Here's Seth Kaplan with Airline Weekly, who's joining us. I know you've been checking in. So again, very good news that we're hearing that stop has now been lifted. The grounded nationwide, that has been lifted.
Yeah, very good news, obviously. So now it's just a matter of getting everything back in order, getting passengers to where they're going through the usual ways that airlines reaccommodate passengers. I mean, this happens every day. You have a flight cancellation here or there. The difference is that obviously in this case, I mean, you start to do the math, you have well into the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of passengers probably impacted by this. And so it will take some time to get them to where they're going.
Yeah, we're looking at this image right now, what appears to be LAX, I believe, and we saw crowds growing inside, now outside, even as curbside check-in there, but you can see how the crowds have been filling in there. So the FAA is saying that the United ground stop has been lifted. Seth, talk to us a little bit about, yes, that's great news, but it may be some time before we see these people actually in their planes and up in the air.
Yeah, and it's going to be somewhat of a competition, really, for all the few empty seats on the remaining flights between all these passengers who want those seats. And so, this is when it starts to get into a situation where if you're a passenger, you have to be smart about getting there because, yeah, once the flights resume, I mean, first of all, you have planes and people out of position in some cases. You're not, the aircraft that was supposed to be departing from one city right now isn't there because it's stuck back at the other city. And so that will take some time for the airline. And then again, just trying to find the seats for everybody to get to where they're going. Passengers, by the way, can help themselves, Francis, on a day like today. Help the airline help you, basically, because, yeah, those gate agents, I mean, they're overwhelmed right now. So if you are flexible, let's say, if your boarding pass says you're supposed to go to LaGuardia and you don't mind going to JFK instead, tell the gate agent that, because that could make the difference. Little things like that can help you, kind of win the empty seat lottery and get to where you're going faster than somebody else. All
right. How can other airlines come into play when it comes to that, too, helping them out? We're seeing these United flights there out of LAX, a live look at that, stuck there. So if I'm a passenger, I'm saying, all right, if I want to get out of Dodge, can I go and look at American? And how easy will it be to do that?
You can, but generally what happens is that the airline, on which your ticket, United in this case, has to endorse your ticket over to the other airline, generally speaking. So it would be United arranging for you to go there. But there again, if you can say to that gate agent, hey, I see a flight that I think could help me going to somewhere else, don't be afraid to say that to them because, especially in a situation like this, they have some latitude there to do things like that. It's actually going to cost United quite a bit of money, but right now they're just trying to get people through the system. So yeah, the other airlines will certainly come into play, but it's all going to start with United. But definitely, whatever flexibility you have in terms of, connecting over a different hub or going to a different airport, tell the airline that because it could make the difference.
Well, Kenya Barter, is it too early to say, all right, I'm willing to go to a JFK instead of LaGuardia, but, can you give me a travel voucher, or is that even not on the radar for these people?
Yeah, well, they'll have some. I mean, certainly, they've got vouchers to get you a meal and that sort of thing. A lot of it will probably come later down to the customer service department. The gate agents at the airports have certain latitude, but then later, if you say, hey, this was your fault, you write to United, say this was your fault, and I got to where I was going a day later, they'll probably compensate you in some kind of way. But generally speaking, right now the goal is just try to get to where you're going and tell them how flexible you are, what you're willing to put up with to get there. And by the way, we gave the JFK LaGuardia example. I mean, if you're willing to fly to Philadelphia or to Hartford, tell them that. I mean, whatever you're willing to do, tell it to them, because it really could make the difference.
It is astounding what we're looking at out of LAX. It doesn't seem like just a random group of crowds there waiting. That seems to be, appears to be a line forming all the way outside. As you can imagine, many of these passengers, hundreds of passengers, thousands of passengers with 3,500 flights, as CNBC has been reporting, as affected by this United ground stop.